Iran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. This has been a red line for decades, going back to President Clinton. And the reason is because the results would be catastrophic. It would create an existential threat to our allies and partners in the region, such as Israel. Even worse, it would create a threat to our heroic service members at a time when Iran and its proxies have already shed blood and have that blood on their hands. It would trigger a regional arms race as countries threatened by Iran's persistent malign aggression seek their own nuclear deterrent. And it would lead to an even more assertive and aggressive Iran that would be emboldened by its perceived security guarantees that come with a nuclear weapon. That's why Israel's recent military campaign against Iran, which culminated in the successful airstrikes ordered by President Trump on Iran's key nuclear facilities, is so important. Iran is now as weak Iran is now as weak now as it ever has been since the 1980s, probably weaker. The strikes have delayed Iran's path to a nuclear weapon by a few years. But in order to seize this moment, the U.S. and our allies must impose maximum pressure to the highest extent possible to force Iran to permanently and verifiably end its nuclear program, including its capacity to enrich uranium. This is why the snapback of UN sanctions is so important. 10 years ago, Iran made commitments under JCPOA, including reducing its enriching of uranium and its uranium stockpile, limiting the enrichment of uranium and its centrifuges, and allowing intrusive monitoring. As a result, the UN passed UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which endorsed the JCPOA. In exchange for Iran's compliance, it provided for the eventual termination of all previous UN sanctions targeting Iran's nuclear program after 10 years. It also sunset UN arms restrictions on Iran after 5 years and UN prohibitions on Iran's missile and drone activities after 8 years, both of which have now expired. However, even before the prohibitions ended, Iran was blatantly violating them, sending suicide drones to Russia and weapons of terror to its proxies like Hamas and the Houthis. These sanctions shouldn't have not been allowed to expire in the first place, especially when the price was the destruction of European cities and the lives of American citizens threatened by Iranian weapons. Under 2231, any signatory to the JCPOA, which includes the UK, France, and Germany, can trigger the snapback of these waived sanctions and restrictions if Iran is in, quote, significant non-performance of its commitments under the JCPOA, end quote. Not only has Iran blatantly violated these commitments, it has done so repeatedly for 6 years, all without consequences from the UN. On top of that, in June, the IAEA, the world's nuclear watchdog, for the first time in 2 decades, declared that Iran had failed to comply with its IAEA safeguard obligations. And how did Iran respond? By threatening Director General Grossi and effectively kicking out the IAEA's remaining inspectors and booting them out of the country. From breaching the cap on its stockpile of uranium and enriching to 60%, to expanding its nuclear enrichment facilities, Iran has trampled on its obligations under the JCPOA. So where does that leave us? The West has 87 days before we lose our ability to snap back tough UN sanctions on Iran. That opportunity permanently expires October 18th. But the real deadline is much sooner. The snapback process takes at least 30 days to fully complete. Adding to the urgency, Russia is set to take over the president of the UN Security Council in October. This would allow Russia to use its position to delay the process and run out the clock. Iran knows this. Just yesterday, Iran held talks with Russia and Communist China to discuss preventing the activation of the snapback. This cannot be allowed to happen. Our European allies have said that they are prepared to trigger snapback by the end of August if no firm, tangible, and verifiable nuclear commitments from Iran are in place. This is being done in coordination with the Trump administration, who continues to pursue diplomatic talks with Iran. I commend our allies for setting a deadline. However, this path is under a timeline that leaves little room for error. Unsurprisingly, the Iranian regime is resorting to its long-standing playbook to delay, and prevent snapback from happening. Later this week, the Iranians are scheduled to meet with the E3 in Istanbul. There are rumors that the discussions could center on what conditions the E3 would postpone the snapback. But today, I stand to urge our European friends to hold the line and not to bend to Iranian threats or be fooled by Iranian assurances. After 10 years, Iran does not need more time. It needs more pressure. A window now exists to completely change the trajectory of the Middle East for the better. But that window will close unless we convince Iran that its nuclear weapons program will never be tolerated, period. That's why this resolution urges the E3 to snap back sanctions as soon as possible. We must not let Iran off the hook. At this point, I'd certainly love to hear from my esteemed colleague from Idaho. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.